Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Why Do I Care? I'm your host, Toby Favalora,
And I'm Alex Gervais.
and today we'll be discussing the shooting, this assassination on Brian Thompson, who is a UHC CEO. So, without further ado, let's get right to it.
Am I doing it, Toby?
I kind of figured you would. Do something to
All
say.
right, wait. I need to. All right, okay, give me a second to reflect. All right. On December 4th, 6:45 a.m., at a Hilton Hotel in New York City, United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson was shot dead by Luigi Mangione, a former Penn student turned assassin. This has become one of the most riveting news stories of the month, really, and really of the year, and says a lot about the American society that we currently live in.
Yeah, I completely agree. So, before we kind of get into what this really means, what it tells us about how Americans view our healthcare system and all that, just some basic facts of this. So, Luigi, the shooter, um, he was a valedictorian at the Gilman School in Baltimore. He came from one of Maryland's wealthiest, most connected families. He went to Penn, graduated in 2020. You know, typical kind of life
Hmm.
of the party, tech bro type of vibe. Um, he later struggled with some chronic back pain and some brain fog, which got in the way of him doing a bunch of normal activities. Um, but yeah, he lived in Hawaii, but then he kind of disappeared from everything 6 months ago. And then this is what he did.
Yeah, I mean, you had like friends posting on social media, like, "Hey, like Luigi, where are you?" His mother even started kind of like a manhunt for him
Hmm.
after he disappeared. But again, yeah, nobody really heard from him for years or for months, and it was kind of like this spiraling that nobody really knew what was going on with him.
Yeah, so he, you know, wasn't he's an assassin. It was a very clear, deliberate assassination attempt. If you saw the video, you could tell like he was just waiting outside ready to shoot. So what he did is he arrived in New York City on November 24th, um, checks into a hotel using a fake ID, and he kind of just waits there until December 4th. And I don't really know how many days are in November, so that's either 10 days or 11 days of waiting. Couldn't tell you which. Um, but yeah, it was very premeditated, very planned.
Hmm.
Um, he left the hotel in the morning. He stopped at Starbucks, and then he assassinated Brian Thompson at 6:45 a.m. and then just left as quickly as possible. Um, yeah, so that's kind of what happened. And then there was a manhunt that followed.
Yeah, and in the ensuing manhunt, it went on for a few days. The NYPD found a backpack full of Monopoly money that he apparently left in Central Park. And then he was found by a McDonald's employee in Altoona, Pennsylvania, at their McDonald's, which is still wild to think about the amount of money that goes into the NYPD, especially. The billions they spend every year that they could not find a guy because he went and walked into Central Park and then took a Greyhound bus to Pennsylvania, and it took a McDonald's employee to do it. That's kind of wild to me.
Yeah, and when we talk about Central Park, that was kind of the key to this whole thing. Like this entire thing was very clearly planned and mapped out. And he was smart. It is clear that he was like a valedictorian and went to an
Hmm.
Ivy. Like this, it's very clear because he knew exactly what to do, and this was very, very thought out and planned. Um, yeah, just in general, Central Park not having security at all is kind of a, I don't know. It's just I feel like they should kind of maybe look into that. But they did ultimately find him. Um, he was arrested. Now all this stuff, more stuff is coming out about his past. So he was charged with illegal weapons possession in Pennsylvania, and then obviously he's going to be charged with
Hmm.
first degree murder in New York. Um, the defense fund has already raised close to $60,000, which is something that we will talk about because the public is really behind this assassination, which I feel like is we can talk about this a little
Yeah.
bit later, but like assassination is never good. You should never kill anybody, especially just like this bold, like clear murder. But there's it reveals genuine frustration in the healthcare system underlying it, which is why there's so much support for it, even though there
Mhm.
shouldn't be. Like, this is a murder. We all saw the video. There's no way that this defense even really gets close to anything. Like, he's going to jail for a long time. It was on video.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, also reflecting on kind of the trial, the charges. We saw him being escorted from essentially a police car into a prison, and he was yelling about like to the media about them kind of being like biased and serving the elites. And then we also had this very interesting moment the other day when Ashley Banfield, who's a news anchor, and Alex Capriello, I think that's how you say his last name, who was reporting on kind of Luigi's conditions in prison. They were standing outside the prison gates, right? And the inmates were watching their program on TV, and they were essentially interviewing the inmates, and they were yelling out answers from the prison to the reporters outside, which was in an interesting moment journalistically. But what they were saying is important too. They were saying that Mangione's conditions are not good in the prison, which is kind of like the opposite of what a lot of conservative pundits were pushing. I don't know if you saw, but there was a clip of Jesse Waters, Trinity College alum, yeah, who was he was saying that like essentially like he hoped that Mangione was killed in prison, but meanwhile he's kind of been supported by the other prisoners where he is right now.
Yeah, so there's a lot. And what it gets to is kind of this divide that we see. Obviously, he shouldn't be killed in prison. Nobody should be killed in prison.
Hmm.
Nobody should be killed anywhere. I think just in general, murder is not the right way to do things. Assassination shouldn't have happened, and now he should not be murdered in prison. But this reaction that we see from the public, it kind of gets to the core of what people see as some people classify as like a class divide in politics, but other people they may just do like a partisan divide. Um, the fact is, people are unhappy with how healthcare is in America, like the healthcare
Hmm.
system. Like they get, denied funds. Like they can't afford to do what they need to do to keep people alive. And there's a very uncomfortable situation that they get put in. It's like, do I try to take my meds every other day so I can feed my family, or do I try to see how long I can take without the surgery, or like all these things, like these horrific things that you would never want to be in a position to have to even imagine. Like, what would I do in that situation? And there's just a lot of frustration with the healthcare system. There has been a lot of frustration with the healthcare system since 2008, back when
Yeah.
politics was less very uh, kind of contentious, I would say. But
Hmm.
I think what it boils down to is people are unhappy with the systems in place. Point blank. People are unhappy with the government. People are unhappy with healthcare. People are unhappy with the media. And this assassination is something that they feel was necessary
Hmm.
because they felt like the systems wasn't actually working for them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a manifestation of anti-establishment beliefs, right? And it's something that when you look at it in kind of a wider political lens, you can situate it in the recent election of Trump, but even his 2016 election and the very recent wave of populism, especially right-wing populism, that has really washed over our entire globe. Um, and it really it says a lot about how people feel right now, and that they're frustrated, they're fed up, and violence is really what happens when people are frustrated and fed up.
Yeah. And the way that I kind of see where we are right now is that we haven't really experienced fully what social media can do to
Hmm.
a government. Because since social media has been out, people have been decently happy with the way that their government is working for them. Happy enough. Like the Obama years, people were happy enough. Trump was elected. That was kind of like a normal shift from like, oh, we're not actually happy with the establishment. We're going to elect an outsider. That was something normal that we
Hmm.
expected. 2020, I think, really accelerated things. We see this in January 6th. We see this in how some of the Black Lives Matter protests turned violent. We see this in, how people don't want to vaccinate themselves and all these things. Like we see this, and I think this is the first time that we are really seeing the direct result of widespread social media. I know that there have been other movements that had social media involved, like 2014ish, but that wasn't necessarily as widespread. Now everybody has social media. And I think because of that, people are able to see a video like this. And some random person might say, like, oh, good, whatever. And then people are like, oh, somebody else agrees with me, and like it kind of builds up on itself.
Hmm.
And I feel like that we haven't really seen yet before is a a platform or a way that people can talk about their grievances without being directly criticized for them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I feel you there, where it's like people tend to kind of get locked into their own, echo chambers. We talked about this before, but also like the fact that you can kind of be hide behind a screen,
Mm-hmm.
um, because like I don't know how many people would still take, aggressively radical stances, outwardly. Like it takes people who are very strong characters and very much righteous in their beliefs to take those, aggressively radical stances, a Malcolm X, a Black Panther, right? People who are going to actually like stand out and stand up. That seems kind of more common on social media now, but less common in real life, right? People tend not to go to these actual violent means; they just talk about it. So, like again, this is just it's interesting to see how like the assassin took kind of this online rhetoric and made it into the real life. It's also worth to note that he isn't on the left politically either. I think that that's something that people don't really talk about a lot with this. But like when he was still active on social media, he'd post a lot about, he was a finance bro. He was kind of like your average center right kind of finance bro dude, very much like Nikki Haley. But then kind of like the anti-establishmentism drove him to that violence, right, against the healthcare industry.
Yeah, and we can talk a little bit more. I want to talk about some of the reactions Ben Shapiro got
Hmm.
on a video about this. But something that's important to note is that this was because of the healthcare industry. Like the
Yeah.
bullets were written on the bullets was deny, defend, depose, which is just a referendum on the healthcare community. Um, it's clear that this was done for not necessarily political purposes, but just for because of the healthcare industry. And there's been stories about like what happened to him that made him really hate the healthcare. And some people are like, oh, it was like a grandfather, or like, oh, it might have been his own personal stuff. It's a whole kind of mess. But I just do want to point out that this was 100% because of the healthcare
Hmm.
system
Yeah.
in America. As for the Ben Shapiro video I mentioned earlier, Ben Shapiro made a video basically saying like, oh, this is bad, like no one should ever do this, blah blah blah, very right wing stuff. Um, Obviously, I agree, no one should assassinate anybody. Um, but like the way in which he went about it was very like Democrats want this. This is like crazy lunatic
Hmm.
left liberals, blah blah blah, assassinate, blah 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 blah. First of all, assassination should never be done. We have to understand why people did it, and we have to kind of talk about what underlying problems occur. And that's what happened in the comment section of a Ben Shapiro video. Is that everybody was like, I kind of agree with him. Like, I agree that the healthcare system is messed up, and I don't think it should have been done violently. But there was a disconnect between Ben Shapiro and
Hmm.
his supporters, which is important to note because unlike politicians, those popular pundits, people listen to like like if it's like a politician who says most of what you agree, but
Hmm.
like you could support a politician even if you don't agree with 100% of the stuff, or even if you disagree about a bunch of the stuff because they're running and you kind of understand how it would work. But with some of these pundits, it's like if you don't agree with them and you don't watch them or listen to them, nothing happens bad politically, which is why it
Hmm.
was so surprising because those people in the comments are like the most diehard supporters. So having that conversation take place on the right is something that's of note, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, you also have to think about where kind of their ideologies stem from, right? The Tuckers, the Ben Shapiros, the Jesse Waters of the world, they were conservatives even pre-Trump, right? When you like, I mean, Tucker claims he wasn't, but he's wrong, right? Their ideals come from the anti-establishmentism that was kind of enshrined during the Tea Party era, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
government is always democratic, meaning government is always bad, right? And so that's really the context you have to think about, right? When we're talking about these like right-wing, media pundits, that they are always anti-government, anti-establishment, but then the CEO gets killed and suddenly, no, we're not, right? And so it's an interesting dichotomy.
Yeah, no, I completely agree because the healthcare system is one that it when we talk about how politics has been recently, like I would say 2020, 2024 especially, is it's kind of become more of a class divide. And I would say the Democrats have been losing some of their voters over issues of, but like we obviously know that Democrats are better for the economy and they're better for this and better for that. But I don't think there is anything as clear as healthcare for the difference between the two parties. Like one party just blatantly wants the healthcare industry to have all the power and rip people off, and most Democrats, are more than happy to have the government subsidize, have the government talk about you know negotiating prices for medications and all these things, and it's like this is, I think, the clearest example of why Democrats lose elections is because they suck at marketing themselves.
Mhm.
Because they have a great plan about it. People are clearly unhappy with it, yet it wasn't a conversation, really, even though Biden did a lot of great things.
Yeah, I mean, like during the election, I think the most poignant quote about healthcare was, "I have concepts of a plan," right? But that came from Donald Trump, and then there was no real response from the Harris campaign. They played the clip constantly on TV, on social media, but yet they didn't tell us exactly what their plan was, right? Because when you're talking about, the continuation of funding healthcare in this country, you can't just say we're going to keep doing Obamacare, right? You have
Mm-hmm.
to remind the American voters of what Obamacare is every day, right? I think that's what we're missing, right? Because I mean, a lot of people don't even realize the ACA and Obamacare are the exact same thing, right?
Yeah,
Because
that's
conservatives, they won the messaging battle, right, in the 2010s about that. But what we have to do is say, this is what the government is going to do for you should Kamala Harris be elected, even if we're already doing it, right? But just say, like, yes, we are going to subsidize medical costs. We are going to, negotiate with those big drug companies. We are going to make sure that people can actually have health care. Don't just say we are going to continue Obamacare.
yeah. So the issue is that I think it boils down to, and I feel like every podcast gets to this, it boils down to the messaging through the media.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the reason that this happened, well, not necessarily the reason that it happened, but part of the reason is that it happened is that there is felt to be no trust in the institutions in order to do something about like healthcare in America. You know what I mean? It's like the
Mm-hmm.
reason that violence was resorted to was because they couldn't trust the institutions. And this goes, honestly, Democrats they should have had a plan that people understood. And it's just, I'm so surprised that they're so bad at messaging because I I don't know how they keep losing the messaging battle. It's like it's not that hard to figure out, truth be told. You don't need like a liberal Joe Rogan or anything like that. You just need to be talk about your plans. You talk about it in a way that isn't condescending.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that hard. Like John Ossoff recently just did a TikTok. I think he's probably running in 2028 based off of
Yeah.
that, obviously. But I think it's just like we see this. Like Jeff Jackson did a whole thing on TikTok, and that was greatly popular. And it's not that hard. You set up a tripod and you talk about your issues directly to the voters. You don't have to pay for it. It's naturally kind of can catch on, and it feels like the messaging battle is being lost, not because the right has some gigantic media apparatus, even though it kind of does, but it feels like the Democrats aren't even trying.
Well, and I think the broader issue here is that Republicans have a why and Democrats do not, right?
Mm,
When Republicans talk, it is always about America first now, right? And that is their why constantly. And that resonates with 45% of Americans, right? And then there's another 45% of Americans who will never ever vote for a Republican ever. You and I both fall into that basket, very much in that basket, right? And then there's 10% of Americans who are going to listen to who has the better why, right?
hmm
And that is where we're losing. We're losing because people don't think that Democrats have ideals. Like I think over the last couple months actually, we've been started to really see, or a lot of people have started to see Democrats as almost like a party of corruption right? You look at Nancy Pelosi, Bob Menendez, Eric Adams, right? Like, we are not putting a good face on the Democratic Party. We need to redefine our message, right? And actually have a message, have a why in order to win elections.
That's the biggest thing, is because you can't name it. I struggle, as I would say, I'm very tuned into politics, especially Democratic politics. I struggle to name big Democratic policies. Like, I could, obviously, but I struggle to, like, there's not, like, the Republicans, they have a message because they have something that they kind of believe in. And I think a big part of that is because they have one person at the top, and Democrats don't really, and they never really. Even when Nancy Pelosi stepped down, she was still kind of calling the shot. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I feel like that is something that the Democratic Party needs to fix. Is they need to be effective with their messaging and give people hope in America. And I feel like that's what was so great about Barack Obama, is his hope message, it really did work. And I feel like Build Back Better was an amazing thing, but it didn't really carry through. They kind of dropped that too early. I think Build Back Better was phenomenal. I think that whole messaging campaign was great. I think if you hear it, you're like, oh, I know what we're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this ties back to the shooting, because Democrats don't have, like, they don't have a big plan. Like, if I were to say, like, what do Democrats want to do to fix healthcare? We can give some, nitty
Mm-hmm.
gritty, whatever, but there's no big plan, and it's not effectively communicated. And I think that the biggest issue is they have plans, but it's like, it kind of sounds like the know-it-all who's just like, like, just like yapping about God knows what. And it feels like they're kind of, the way that they message, if they do message at all, makes it seem because they want to run off of past accomplishments. Like, they can't say, oh, Obamacare didn't do enough,
Mm-hmm.
but they should.
Well, Toby, I think that it's not that they have no plan; it's that they have no vision. I think that
Sure, yes.
they're like, yes, we're going to do this thing and this thing and this thing, but what is the end result? Um,
Hmm.
and I mean, part of it is just kind of an issue with liberal philosophy at its core, that liberalism really has no end, right? We've seen, I'm going to take us out like conceptually political science here, right? Like Francis Fukuyama, right? End of history. We've seen that he was clearly wrong, right? And that there is no end to like liberal democracy becoming the overarching thing that is forever, right? There's always going to be
Hmm.
competition of ideology, of morals, right? But what we've seen is that conservatives kind of have this end view of their ideal America that they are willing to impose, but the Democratic Party does not have an ideal America, right? Like, they have no idea of what progress is actually going to look like in 20 years. And I think that's what we need to talk about. Like, what is it that we are striving for? What are we reaching for?
I think that's exactly right, because if you look at it, like, Democrats want to push us forward and do new things, but Republicans want us to go backwards onto more traditional values. And we know what traditional values are because we live
Mm-hmm.
those values. We know what the 60s were like, but we don't really know what the Democrats want to do. We don't know what a society looks like if Democrats are able to impose everything. We don't know. And that's what the issue is that Republicans, they don't really have to message too effectively, because people know. People live through it. People live through a, pre-Roe, pre-Civil Rights Act, pre-whatever they want, They live that life. And people haven't lived a democratic life, or like a liberal life. People haven't
Mm-hmm.
had, like, this healthcare, whatever, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security that actually works for people. We haven't had these social welfare programs that actually lift people up. And there's all these things that the closest we got to was FDR, or maybe LBJ, the closest we got to, but that was kind of, it wasn't enough. And we saw that was progress, but it's been enough time that has passed, is that people look back on that and they see that as a conservative type of thing, because conservatives are like, we want to go back to this period,
Mm-hmm.
even though Democrats were in charge. And that's why I think the messaging battle was being lost, is because, like you said, no vision. I think you put that very well. And I feel like this healthcare is one of the biggest issues. I think healthcare and the economy, and I think healthcare and the economy, and I don't really, jobs, that would kind of go into the economy. Like, these are
Hmm.
things that people really care about because it's a numbers game. And I feel like that's what Republicans were so good at in the last election is they're like, Democrats want to use your tax dollars to pay for this very small group of people. And it's just a numbers game. It's just a numbers game. If you have a policy that makes the majority, whatever the majority may be in America, I couldn't name, it's probably working class people, I would imagine. And it might be more specifically white working class people. Just like the majority, just like by numbers, like demographically. Is that give or take right?
I mean, white working class wouldn't make majority. I believe white people in general are still the majority,
Not
but the
50, not
working
50. I mean, yeah, not 50%. I
plurality.
guess I mean, yeah, like the biggest like kind of chunk. Like if we
Yeah.
break up into chunks, and it feels like Democrats are going after the smallest chunks. Like Republicans are going after the working class, and Democrats recently kind of feels like they've been fighting over like LGBTQ, which 100% they should. But if we just look at a numbers game, it's like 10 to 1 ratio, or like less than that. You know what I mean? And I feel like, yes, that is right to do. And I think Democrats should do that and they should pick that fight, absolutely. But at the end of the day, it's political, it's a numbers game, and they should be championing these policies that will get the most amount of people.
Yeah, and also in a way where you bring your progressive policy in with your populist policy and pair it together and say, I mean, in the case of, LGBTQIA plus rights, it's about personal freedom, right?
Yes.
When you brand it like that, that's how you win elections.
Yes, 100%. Like if you ran on personal freedoms and people, or not even like personal freedoms, but also just like you can make that a First Amendment thing somehow. Be like freedom to express yourself however you want,
Hmm.
whether that be with your gender orientation or your sexual preference or anything like that. But tying that in into the larger thing, that's what makes it stronger. And I
Hmm.
feel like it's a numbers game. And I feel like if you just break up America into, like a hundred things, and you could probably figure out like what groups of people do you need to target and win in order to get the most amount of support. And I feel like Democrats don't really do that. And 100%, I'm not saying. Just let me be clear. I'm not saying that Democrats should avoid minorities or minority things that minorities care about or small like groups that may not have as much economic power. But I do think that messaging wise, it should be different. You know what I mean? Like, I think if the policies stay the same, but I think you should talk about issues that matter to a wider amount of people more than you do. I'm not saying policies change. I'm saying the amount of time spent talking about it.
I I think that Democrats just have to realize that the era of identity politics is kind of dead at this point, and that every voter they're talking to is an American voter, right? I feel
Mm-hmm.
like that message is not underscored enough, right? And like I think that there is no economic policy that is going to speak to any, marginalized group more than any other marginalized group when it actually comes down to things, right? End of the day, people want to have cheaper groceries, they want to have cheaper housing, and that is why they, in the end, voted for Donald Trump because they thought he would bring them that vision, no matter what the social ramifications were, right? So, in order to create a better, more progressive world, you have to understand the economic implications so that you can get elected into office so you can make the social protections that we need to keep, an egalitarian society.
Yeah, I completely agree. So we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back, and then we'll talk about the Why Do I Care part of the podcast. All right, welcome back from that quick break. For the Why Do I Care part of this podcast, the reason you should care is because it is, I'm not going to say revolutionary, but it feels like we're getting to the point where people resort to violence over institutional ways to fix things. And I understand that this assassination was done by somebody who wasn't right mentally. But what's important to understand is the amount of support afterwards. That's the important part, is the support afterwards. And that's what kind of shows me that America and democracy is on a path that they shouldn't be on because people are fed up with the institutions, they resort to violence. That's why you should care.
Hmm. Yeah, I have a story for you, Toby. So, have you heard the name Daniel Penny?
Yeah?
Yeah. So Daniel Penny, he was riding on the New York subway one day. He was approached by a homeless man, and he killed the homeless man, quote, in self-defense. He was recently acquitted of his crime. Laura Ingraham was on Fox. She was talking about Mangione assassinating Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare CEO, and she was saying that it was abhorrent, that it's something that should never happen in America. And then, seconds later, she goes on to say that Daniel Penny should be acquitted, right? So to me, we have this real kind of just dichotomy between what is expected and what happens in this country, and what we as a people can accept. And the reality is that violence, for better or for worse, is becoming more acceptable in the American psyche, right? If you look back to like the 60s, for example, right? That's the last time I think that we really saw this kind of wide-scale political violence, like with the resistance to the civil rights movement, right? So I just think that we are entering an extraordinary time for our country, where extraordinary things will be happening, be they good, be they bad, but it's going to come with more violence than I think a lot of people would have expected 10, 15 years ago.
I completely agree. Yeah, with that, thank you guys all so much for listening to this week's episode. As always, go to whydoicarepod.com to find everything that you may need Why Do I Care related. Yeah, anything else to add? I think they're good.
Yeah, I mean, we are going to be virtual for a few weeks since Toby and I are
Yes.
on college break, but don't worry, come January 22nd, we'll be right back in the
We'll be
lab.
right back there. Yeah, don't you guys worry. All right, thanks for listening. Have a great rest of your day.